We ended talking about split subjectivity between a biological body that you still have and that you've had since birth and that you have right now and that you'll have until you die, human embodiment, and this sociological self, this self that you inherit from society in comportment with the community that you're born into, a linguistic community where you learn to speak words that were not invented for you. These are words that you share with your family, with your neighborhood, with your community. And you wind up with these two selves, a self that is very animalistic, base and material, and a self that is social, civilized, linguistified, as a word I often use, because it has access to language. And those two work together. But oftentimes they find themselves disjointed. You may feel the urge to do something with your body, but the civilized side of you says, I better not do that, or let me find a better way to do that. These two worlds are oftentimes in tension, in other words. What we want to talk about is how we got there and the feeling of loss that they symbolize. Let's start with the latter, at the level of loss. What is lost with the birth of a split subjectivity is simple. It's what was there before subjectivity split. Namely, not a split subjectivity, but a whole one. One in which you were strictly and only an animalistic being. Now, you have no memory of this, you have no experience of this because you were not yet in the field of language. Another complicated topic that we can just set aside for now. It's in hindsight that we experience this loss. In the moment, you didn't know how great you had it. You might say the same about Adam and Eve. When they were in the garden, all was good and well. It wasn't until they were cast out that they can look back and realize what they lost. A theme that also often comes up around the end of an intimate relationship. You may even have heard or have even said to somebody, you don't know how good you have it. You don't even know how good this relationship was, and you're not going to know until it's over. You can say things and hear things like that that suggest to people that they better wake up and realize how good they have it. But that's not how bliss works. When you're blissed out, you are just in the moment like a lizard on a hot rock enjoying. Enjoyment may not be the best word here, as we'll see, but you are in that moment. The same way that the child who cries is simply in that moment. They don't have a reflective experience of what's going on with them or how the cry is being interpreted or any of the usual stuff that adults go through. What's lost, in other words, as the infant becomes the child, the animal baby grows into the child who can use words to tell me what you want, as the parent or primary caregiver often puts it. What's lost is a pre-linguistic world where they didn't have to do that. And there ain't no going back, which is why we have so many fantasies in everyday life that purport to put us back in touch with these Edenic, blissed out, holistic experiences of life. People oftentimes go to nature. They go to the mountains to feel at one with the world. People meditate and have that experience. You love a good hot bath. These are things that suggest to us that there is always this longing for something like Edenic wholeness, a blissed out, pre-linguistic, childlike experience. That's real. It's absolutely real. And yet at the same time, I'm telling you it is primarily fantasy. It's the kind of nostalgia. And let me be clear what I mean by that. Nostalgia is longing for a past that you did not have. It's not a memory of a world that you had and once lost. It's a fantasy. Nostalgia is a fantasy that makes you think you once had a life that you lost and you're trying to regain it. But the reality is that you did not live that life. America was not great in the 1950s. And so it's nostalgia to talk about making it great again by returning to 1950s values. See where I'm going with this? This longing for Edenic wholeness, this pre-linguistic world where all you have to do is cry and somebody shows up to meet your needs, kind of uteromorphic experience. I say uteromorphic because it's a derived experience of being in utero, where all of your needs were completely met, right? You had an umbilical cord, you peed when you wanted to, you pooped when you wanted to, you fed when you wanted to, you slept when you wanted to. When you were in utero, you were in this kind of oceanic, whole Edenic state. And as a child, you're trying to reproduce that by having all your needs met by primary caregivers and so forth. And as an adult, we also learn ways to try and reproduce that, oftentimes at the level of a good hot bath. What else is that immersion in a good hot bath but a return to uteromorphic experience? Now, I don't need to get too far into this. Some of you have seen my lectures on this topic in the past, in courses like the one on bubbles and intimacy. We don't need to get into all that business. What we want to get into now is talking a little bit about this experience of loss that happens when the child is brought into the world of language and as a result can no longer simply cry and expect their needs to be met, but instead is asked to use their words. In other words, to mediate their needs through the language that their parents and primary caregivers and neighborhoods and so forth have taught them. It's no longer enough to simply feel uncomfortable and cry. Now you have to feel uncomfortable, think about the words that you would add to those feelings, and then express them to another person in hopes of figuring something out. That's a complicated process. And what I would like to suggest is that when a child accepts that they will have to use their words from now on if they're going to get what they want, accepts in this case that they should feel embarrassed even when they start crying. So someone starts crying and you go up and you say, "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" And they, I'm fine, it's nothing. They can't bear to have themselves be experienced as a little infantile, crying being. Because they know and they have accepted that the best way to have your needs met is to express them in language, like a proper young lady or gentleman, right? This leads me to something, to a process that is present in all normal neurotic beings, but according to Lacan, the person who we are reading, is absent in all psychotic subjectivities. The word he uses here, for better and for worse, comes to us in English as castration. We might think of it also as a kind of primitive alienation. That seems to work a little bit better. It suggests to me that the first word, literally but more precisely figuratively, that each of us learned, embraced, and has mastered, if we're lucky, is no. The first word was no. Thou shalt not continue to cry like a baby and expect to have your needs met. No, thou shalt not speak a language that is of your own creation. Instead, you'll speak like me, like your community, like other people in the mother's tongue. In other words, whether or not the first word you learned to say was no, and it very well might have been, your first experience of language was as a fundamental no. In other words, as a prohibition. Now, what's prohibited? Again, what's prohibited by language as it is imposed upon you is you are now prohibited from acting as though that hasn't happened, from acting as though it's perfectly acceptable for you to continue crying wordlessly and expecting somebody else to meet your needs. It's no longer acceptable to do that. Language fundamentally prohibits animalistic being, pre-linguistic being, from finding expression without mediation through the field of society, civilization, and language. That's what's prohibited. Adam and Eve cannot go back to the Garden of Eden. They live on the outside in shame. Doesn't mean they don't keep longing for it, dreaming about it, the same way that we fantasize about gardens of Edens every time we put up a privacy fence. The point here is that learning to talk, learning to speak, is always experienced as a fundamental prohibition. And it is a prohibition against refusing to learn how to speak. In other words, it's a prohibition against ever returning to a pre-linguistic state. The basis for neurosis is an acceptance of this. It's an acceptance of this prohibition. A prohibition that results in the split subjectivity we've been talking about. The neurotic subject, the quote-unquote normal person, is somebody who has accepted that they can't simply cry their way through life and expect that they're going to get what they want. In other words, they've been socialized enough to know that they have to speak like proper young ladies and gentlemen in order to get their needs met. The psychotic person, according to Lacan, is somebody that not only rejects that castration, that alienation, that prohibition, that fundamental no, but somebody whose rejection and refusal of that fundamental no is so profound that they are able to convince themselves, remember, persuasive artistry, able to convince themselves that it never happened, that there is no other language, that the language that they have in their own mind is the only language that ever needed to be spoken. The basis for psychosis, in other words, according to Lacan, is a fundamental, basic rejection of the symbolic, of the field of language, of the field of society. That's where we'll return next as we dig into the text.